Part 1. The Boy Who Died Wanting. Chapter 1. Mud. Cold mud. That was the last thing Kale of the Drenic Borderlands ever felt. Not steel, not the Duke's mana, not even pain after the first second. Just the wet cold of a field that had been churned to soup by 10,000 boots, soaking through the back of his tunic, his hair, the space between his fingers as he lay spread-eagled and stared up at a sky the color of pewter. Family, he thought. Not revenge, not the campaign, not the brothers in arms whose names he'd already half forgotten. Just family. The Duke, Vareth Calder, one of 6 hex-bound blades of the Valorian Empire, a man so dense with mana that birds wouldn't fly within 100 meters of his silhouette, had looked at him before the final blow with something close to pity. "You've the talent for it," Calder had said. "Another decade and I'd have fought you seriously." He'd meant it as mercy. Kale had raised his sword anyway. He'd been 16 when they conscripted him, an orphan camp kid who'd learned to fight by watching, stealing, and surviving. No name that mattered, no house. The battalion had called him Stray, then Ghost, then finally Kale the Iron Thread when he'd cut through a cavalry line alone at the Battle of Renford and walked out the other side bleeding from 8 places. He'd had quadruple mana cores by 23, unheard of. The Empire had started building propaganda about him, the soldier who came from nothing. From nothing. That was the thing. That was always the thing. He'd tried, once, to find his mother's grave. A lieutenant had helped him look through the massacre records. Her name wasn't there. She hadn't been important enough to record. She'd simply stopped existing somewhere in the chaos before he'd opened his eyes, and the world had moved on without marking the loss. He'd fought for an empire that never noticed she was gone. So when Vareth Calder ran him through the chest on that nameless field, and Kale flew backward through the air and hit the mud and felt the cold, his last thought was not rage. It was not regret. It was the image of a table set for dinner, steam rising from bowls, someone calling his name from another room, warm and without urgency, just to say, "Come in, it's ready." He'd never had that, not once. Everything went dark. Then something yanked, not pulled, not faded, yanked like a rope jerked taut, and the darkness shattered into unbearable light and cold air on wet skin and a sound like the world cracking in half. And that sound was himself, crying. Because he was 3 seconds old and his lungs were new and they didn't know yet that crying wasn't the answer. He opened his eyes. 2 faces looked down at him. The man was broad-jawed and laughing with tears on his face, holding something, a spear, in one hand and reaching for the baby with the other, while a woman behind him smacked his shoulder repeatedly and said with great precision, "Put that down, you absolute disaster of a man. Put it down right now." Warmth. Someone's arms. A chest against his cheek that smelled like pine resin and old leather. Oh, thought Kale, newly an infant, newly in possession of lungs that couldn't yet form words. Oh. Chapter 2. 4 Objects. His new name was Davin Wren, youngest child of Count Aldrich Wren and his wife Saris Wren, formerly Saris of the Silver Thread, which was not, as Davin quickly gathered from overheard arguments, a metaphor. His mother had literally threaded silver garrots. She had been, in a prior career she described as consulting, the woman courts hired when they needed a problem to stop existing quietly. His father was Aldrich Wren, the Blue Heron, one of the finest spearmen the Kaldori Empire had produced in a generation, hex-bound ranked, and constitutionally incapable of entering a room without immediately demonstrating this to whatever infant happened to be present. "Look," his father said, when Davin was approximately 4 days old, holding a spear horizontally so the infant could examine its total length. "Feel the balance, even the grip." "Aldrich," his mother said, "he's looking at it." "He's looking at the light fixture." "He has excellent taste in light fixtures. That's how I know he'll be a spearman." Davin, who had been staring at the light fixture because he was 4 days old and working with very limited controls, thought, "This man. This specific man." He loved him immediately and completely, and with the weary exasperation of someone who had met this exact energy on 100 battlefields, always attached to a soldier who was about to do something heroic and catastrophically unplanned. His mother, Saris, was a different kind of warmth. She talked to him constantly, not baby talk, but real things, information delivered at a murmur while she moved through the house. That's the east staircase. It's the fastest to the ground floor. That window faces the garden. You can see anyone coming from the north road. Your father thinks nobody notices when he skips the second-to-last step going up because it creaks. Everyone notices. She was teaching him the house. She had been teaching him the house since he was 3 weeks old. She knows, he thought during week 4. She doesn't know she knows, but she knows. He had 2 older sisters, Rhea, 11 years old and already terrorizing the mage academies with what their father described as talent, and what was, more accurately, an almost offensive natural affinity for magical constructs. She had reached 3rd circle by her own birthday and had celebrated by redesigning the estate's entire magical security system because the original was boring. And Lena, 9, who could currently hold 3 summons simultaneously and had named them all after fish, and who handled Davin with the careful reverence of someone presented with a gift she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure she deserved. He watched them those first months. He catalogued. The house of Count Ren was a good house, a warm house. Saris kissed Aldrich's shoulder while he read dispatches, so quickly she probably didn't know she did it. Rhea left her most recent magical workings on the kitchen table for their father to look at, always face down, always as if she'd just happened to leave them there. Lena asked her summons to watch over Devon's crib at night, not as a command, as a request, her voice dropping to something almost shy. Kale had died at 23 in a field of mud thinking about a table set for dinner. He was 3 months old and lying in a crib in a house full of people who were already, in their separate, clumsy ways, fighting over who got to shape him, and his chest ached with something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite joy and had no word for it in any language he'd learned on either side of death. The choosing ceremony happened on his 1st birthday. House Wren had done it for 7 generations. When the youngest child turned 1, 4 objects were arranged on a low table in the main hall, and the child crawled to whatever called to them, and the family read the future from the direction of small hands. Aldrich placed the heron spear, a weapon famous enough that it had a name, a blade of tempered silver-blue steel that had been in his family longer than the estate itself, its shaft carved with the House Wren crest. Saris placed a dagger called Nightfall, black-handled, made of a metal that held poison like a second nature, and released it only to its bearer's intention. Rhea, who had been awake since 4 in the morning, vibrating with barely contained energy, placed an arcane focus, a crystal sphere no larger than a fist, threaded with golden filigree, keyed to her mana signature, but designed to expand, to grow, to wait for someone new. Lena, who had spent 2 weeks making the decision, placed a summoner's token, a small disc etched with the sigil of her current familiar pact, offered with the idea that whatever creature answered it might choose a different master if the new master was right. The hall was full. Extended family, tenants, 2 minor lords from neighboring estates. Aldrich's battalion commander, who had ridden 3 days for this. Saris's former handler, who Devon recognized instantly from the quality of how she stood, and who Saris greeted with the warmth of someone who had once trusted this person with her life. Devon sat in the center of the room, surrounded by candles and watching adults. He looked at the table. He thought, with the full weight of a man who had spent 23 years on a battlefield, none of this is actually a choice. I know what I am. The question is whether the objects know it too. He crawled toward the table. He heard his father stop breathing. He heard his mother's hand tighten on her own sleeve. A small sound, silk against palm, barely nothing. He got close. He reached out. And all four objects began to glow, not sequentially, not slowly, at once, simultaneously, a warm gold light rising from each item like heat from a fire. The spear, the dagger, the sphere, the token, all of them, all four, all at once. The hall went completely silent. Devon looked at the light. He thought, of course. He thought, of course, of course, of course. Someone behind him made a sound that might have been a sob. He didn't know who. His father turned to his mother, and his voice when it came was very quiet. Well, Aldrich said, I suppose we're all teaching him. Saris looked at the glowing objects for a long moment. Then she looked at her husband. Then she looked at her daughters. Rhea, who had both fists pressed against her mouth and was making a very high, very controlled sound of absolute delight. Lena, who was simply crying, silently, the way she cried at good things. Yes, Saris said. Her voice was perfectly level. I suppose we are. Devon sat in the center of his first birthday, surrounded by light and people who loved him so much they were already arguing about which kind of love got to come first. And he thought about a man who had died in a field, wanting nothing more than a table set for dinner. I found it, he thought. I found it. The candles flickered. The ceremony ended. The war over Devon Wren began. Part 2. 7 Years of 4 Wars. Chapter 3. The Training Hall. Rain against the shutters. That was always how the morning started. The rhythm of it, the smell of wet stone coming through the gaps, and then his father's voice carrying up the stairs before dawn had fully committed to existing. Devon, the hall is free! Saris, from somewhere deeper in the house. It's not even light yet, Aldrich. Light is a concept. The spear does not require light. Devon was already dressed. He had been up for an hour. His body remembered the discipline before his mind arrived at it. Old muscle memory, old soldier's habit, up before the horn because the soldiers who waited for the horn were already behind. He'd spent the first year of his life trying to look appropriately infant-like while internally cataloging everything he could reach. By 3, he had given up on the performance. By 5, he had stopped bothering to pretend that the forms his father taught him were new. You're already down here, his father said when Davin appeared in the training hall doorway. You're loud. Aldrich Wren, the Blue Heron, possibly the finest spear practitioner in the Kaldori Empire, grinned with every tooth he had. I prefer enthusiastic. He held up the practice spear. Ready? You're going to show me the rotation drill. I'm going to show you the... He stopped. How did you know? Davin picked up his own practice spear. You always do the rotation drill when it rained the night before. Something about the grip being easier when the air is wet. His father stared at him. Your words, Davin added. Aldrich recovered. He always recovered. Right, yes, the rotation drill, which I will demonstrate. You could just correct my form instead. Aldrich opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his 7-year-old son standing with a practice spear in the guard position that had taken him, the great Blue Heron, until age 15 to stabilize. He walked over. He adjusted 2 things, the angle of Davin's back wrist and the placement of his left foot. There, he said. Thank you. Aldrich stepped back. Something moved in his expression. Not quite grief, not quite awe, something that lived in the space between them. How long have you known that was wrong? 3 months. 3... He stopped again, ran a hand over his face. Why didn't you say something? Davin looked up at him. You looked like you were enjoying teaching it. The training hall was quiet for a moment. Aldrich crouched down to eye level, which he didn't usually do. He was a big man, and crouching required commitment, and looked at Devon steadily. You know, he said, there's a version of fatherhood where I'd feel insulted. I know. And a version where I'd feel proud. I know. Which one do you think I'm feeling? Devon considered. Both, but the proud one is louder. Aldrich Wren put one hand on his son's shoulder and squeezed once, brief and hard, and then stood back up and raised his own spear and said, "Show me what else you've been keeping from me." His mother taught differently. No warning, no schedule. Saris would simply appear, behind him in the garden, beside him in the library, ahead of him on the path to the east courtyard, as if she'd been there first, and say something like, "A person's feet tell you where they're going 6 seconds before they move," or "The third window from the north is original glass. It doesn't reflect the same way. Anyone positioned there can be seen before they see you," or "Smell determines threat faster than sight. You've been ignoring that." She never gave exercises. She never made him drill. She just noticed things, out loud, in his presence. By his 5th birthday, Devon had mapped every concealed entrance in the estate. By his 6th, he'd memorized the movement patterns of every household staff member. By his 7th, he understood without being told that his mother had been doing the same thing when she was small. A different child, a different house, a different kind of danger. And that what she was teaching him was not assassination. She was teaching him how to not be killed. "If I can't be found," he said once, when they were sitting in the garden watching the southern road, "I can't be hurt." Saris turned to look at him. "That's one way to use it," she said, carefully. "That's why you learned it." She was quiet for so long that he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, "I learned it because someone I loved died, and I didn't see it coming. I didn't want that to happen again." "Did it work?" "You're here." She reached over and pushed his hair out of his eyes, a gesture so simple he felt it in his chest like a struck bell. "So far." Rhea visited on holidays and arrived the way weather arrives, announced by disturbance before presence. You would hear something in the upper hallway, something structural, a hum or a crack, and then she would materialize in the doorway, looking as if she'd simply been there all along, and the fact that the air tasted like ozone was a coincidence. She was 12. She was a third circle mage. She had a scar on her left palm from an experiment that had gotten more interesting than planned, and she described this as a success in the category of learning. The first time she sat with Devon after the ceremony, really sat, not performed sibling affection, she looked at him for a long time. "You're not a normal baby," she said. He was 8 months old. He stared at the light fixture. "I know you're not," she continued, as if he'd agreed. "Something in the mana around you. It's dense, like it's waiting, like it's been waiting longer than you've been alive." 8 months old. Kale of the Iron Thread, who had died in mud, lay very still and thought, "She's going to be trouble." Lena came home less than Rhea, but stayed longer. She slept in the room next to Devon's when she visited, and in the mornings, he'd sometimes wake to find one of her summons, a creature like a cat made of pale green light, named Carp, for reasons he never fully established, sitting on the windowsill of his room, watching him sleep. "She asked it to check on you," Aldrich said once, when Devon pointed this out. "Every morning?" "Every morning." Devon looked at the summon cat. The summon cat looked back. "Okay," he said. Chapter 4. The Hidden War. He was 7 when the first real trouble came. Not the family arguing about his training. That was constant, almost musical, a background feature of life in House Wren, the way wind was a background feature of open country. His father wanted spear work before breakfast. His mother wanted perimeter awareness before spear work. Rhea, when she visited, wanted magical theory at any hour she happened to be awake, which was all of them. Lena wanted him to sit quietly with her summons and learn to feel their emotional texture, which was, she explained, the foundation of all summoning, and also just nice. He did all of it. He did all of it and kept each thread separate in his mind, because he understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent a previous life surviving by knowing what the next hour required, that all 4 paths were real, and all 4 would matter, and the conflict between them was his parents' problem to manage, not his. But the hidden war was something else. He noticed it first in the account books. Not snooping, his father's study was open, always had been. Aldrich Wren was constitutionally incapable of keeping secrets from his household. But Davin walked past the desk one afternoon, and the numbers stopped him. The regional revenue projections were wrong, not calculation errors. Wrong in a way that suggested the information feeding them was corrupted, that someone was reporting one harvest yield and recording another. He was 7. He didn't say anything. He watched. By his 8th birthday, he had identified the source, a man named Corvath who managed the eastern fields. Corvath had 3 people helping him. 2 were tenant farmers pressured into it. 1 was a minor clerk in the capital with connections to a rival house, the Brennan family, who had been competing with Wren over southern mining rights for 2 generations. The skimming was small, careful, designed to not quite reach the threshold that would trigger a formal audit. They're not stealing money, Devon thought. They're building a record, a pattern. Evidence that the Count is a poor administrator, something to present at court when they make a move for the mining concession. He watched for another 6 months. He confirmed it. Then he walked into his father's study and told him. Aldrich listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Aldrich. And when Davin finished, he sat very still for a moment. "How long have you known?" he asked. 8 months. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "I needed to be certain." Another pause. "You're 8 years old." "I know." His father looked at him for a long time. The expression was complicated in a way that Davin was only beginning to have words for. Love that didn't know what to do with its own object. Pride entangled with something that was almost grief. The specific sadness of watching something surpass you faster than you were ready. "I'll handle it," Aldrich said. "I know." "Thank you, Davin." The warmth of those words moved through him like something physical. He went to bed that night feeling, for the first time in 2 lives, that he had protected something. Not a battlefield, not a tactical position, a home. Part 3. The Boy's 8th Year and the Visitor. Chapter 5. The Lord Who Killed Him. He was 8 when Verith Calder came to the estate. The smell of rain and horse preceded him by half an hour. Davin heard the gate ward activate from the east wing and came to the window and saw the column coming up the road. A duke's escort, 16 riders in the silver and black of House Calder. The duke himself in the center riding a gray that was better bred than most of the people Davin had known in his first life. The man who had killed him. Cale had died charging him, had died thinking, "Even knowing I can't win, I'd rather die a warrior than live having retreated." Standing at a window, 8 years old, with his hands resting on the sill, Davin watched Verith Calder dismount in the courtyard and thought, "You looked sad when you did it." He hadn't expected to remember that. He'd been bleeding out at the time. But the image was there, clear as river water. The Duke's face. The particular expression of a powerful man doing something he considered a waste. "You've the talent for it," Calder had said. "Another decade, and I'd have fought you seriously." Devon pushed off the windowsill. He went to the main hall. He stood beside his father. When Verith Calder entered, he was different. In memory, the man had been a force, a pressure, the way weather is a force. In the warm light of the Wren Hall, he was just a man in his late 40s, silver-streaked, with lines around his eyes that weren't there in Cale's memory. His daughter Mira walked beside him, dark-haired, quiet, the kind of quiet that came from practice rather than nature, and she walked like someone measuring exits. "Calder," Aldrich said warmly, extending a hand. "Wren," the Duke clasped it. His eyes moved over the hall, stopped on Devon. Something shifted in his expression. "Your youngest?" he asked. "My only son, Devon." Devon looked at the man who had killed him and bowed. "My Lord Duke." Calder studied him for a moment with the eyes of someone who had spent a career reading threat assessments, and Devon waited, perfectly still, perfectly polite. "You have good eyes," the Duke said finally. "Old eyes." "Thank you, my lord." Calder almost said something else. Instead, he turned back to Aldrich, and Devon exhaled very slowly. He almost recognized something, he thought. Not me, not Cale. Something in the way I stood. He filed it away. The birthday banquet, Devon's 8th, was that evening. He endured it with good grace. The formal introductions, the toasts, the other noble children who circled him with the careful assessment of their kind, measuring his house and his rank and his father's standing before deciding whether he was worth speaking to. He talked to Mira Calder by the window. She was 9. She trained with a sword, she said, in the flat tone of someone who expected to be told that girls didn't. She'd won a junior tournament 2 months ago. She had a summon, a small silver fox, and she held her hands in her lap the way people hold things they're trying not to break. You keep looking at the door, she said. Force of habit. What kind of habit? Knowing where to go if things get complicated. She looked at the door. She looked at him. Does it get complicated a lot? At your parties? My family argues, he said, not about bad things, about me. She didn't ask what that meant. She looked out the window instead, at the garden, where her father was walking with his and talking the way 2 men talk when they've been through wars together, side by side, not quite looking at each other, the conversation carried in posture as much as words. My father worries, she said. About what? Everything. A pause. My mother is sick, has been for 3 years. He doesn't know how to be frightened. So he's careful instead. He prepares. He makes arrangements. Her hands tighten slightly in her lap. I want to get stronger so she'll feel safer. Cale had died not knowing what it felt like to have a parent worth worrying about. Then we'd better train seriously, Davin said. She turned and looked at him. When you come to the capital, he added, there's an academy. If you're going, I'll go. We can push each other. She stared at him for a moment with those careful, quiet eyes. You just met me, she said. I know what you're going to become. Which was not something he could explain, not without explaining everything else. But it was true. He could see it in the way she sat, the way she measured the room, the particular attention she gave to everything her father did. She was going to be extraordinary. She already was. Mira Calder looked back out the window. All right, she said. And the simple directness of it, the complete lack of performance, felt more like a real agreement than most oaths he'd sworn in his first life. The next morning, Davin was in the training yard at dawn when Vareth Calder appeared. He'd been doing sword forms, not the spear, the sword, the weapon his father had opinions about, the one Cale had lived and died with for 7 years. His body remembered it the way bodies remember swimming. Before the mind decides, the hands know. He heard the footfall. He recognized the weight of it. He didn't stop. Calder watched from the doorway for a long time. Where did you learn that? He said finally. Books. Davin brought the form to rest. I read about footwork. I extrapolated. Calder was quiet. He walked into the yard. He walked around Davin in a slow half circle, looking, the way a craftsman looks at a finished piece, searching the work for the technique behind it. Those aren't noble school forms, he said. No, they're battlefield forms. Compressed, designed for broken terrain and people trying to kill you from 4 directions. Theoretically. Calder looked at him. Theoretically. I read extensively, Devon said. Boy, the Duke's voice had changed, quieter, more careful. I've spent 40 years watching people fight. The way you stand right now, there's something in it. Not talent, experience. Devon met his eyes. You must be mistaken, my lord. I'm 8. Calder held the eye contact. He was a man who had killed other men and slept afterwards and risen to fight again, and he was accustomed to looking at things clearly. Yes, he said finally, you must be right. He left. Devon stood in the empty training yard for a moment. He doesn't know what he knows, he thought, but he knows something, and it's the same something he noticed in the hall. He was going to need to be more careful. He picked up the sword again and resumed from the beginning. At breakfast, Vareth Calder presented him with a small stone disc. Flat, gray-brown, unremarkable. "A token," he said, "from the Calder Forge. We have the finest smiths on the continent. If you present this when you're old enough, they'll make whatever weapon you want. No questions, no cost." Aldrich stared at the token. "Varith, that's—" "My daughter likes him," Calder said simply, which was not a full explanation, but was apparently all the explanation he intended to offer. Davin turned the disc over in his hands. He thought about the Duke's face in his last memory. "Another decade, and I'd have fought you seriously. I'm giving you the decade," the disc said in its flat, gray way. "Use it better than last time." Part 4. The Rescue. Chapter 6. The Wanderer. He was 14 when he found the old man in the forest. He'd been running his mother's trial, a thing she'd started doing on his 10th birthday. She would seed the eastern forest with every trap she knew, and he had 3 hours to reach the marker on the other side without triggering any of them. And every year, she made it worse. The forest smelled like pine sap and something older, a deep, root-level magic that his mother had told him about when he was small, the kind that lived in the ground itself rather than being cast. Ancient magic, the sort that ate modern spells for breakfast and laughed while doing it. He'd been moving for 2 hours when he heard it. Not a distress call, not a shout, just a sound. Wrong rhythm, wrong placement, wrong everything. He adjusted his path without thinking. Old battlefield instinct, locate the irregular, and found the old man 40 meters off the main trail, sitting with his back against a root system the size of a small building, unconscious. His lips were blue. Devon identified the mushroom cluster 3 steps away, red-capped, innocuous-looking, the kind that coexisted cheerfully with the forest's ambient magic and used the resulting energy to produce a toxin that could stop a grown man's heart in 6 hours. The old man had eaten one, maybe more. He checked the bracelet on the man's wrist, the crest of the Nixian Mage Tower, one of the Empire's great independent magical institutions, and not a common seal. This was a Tower Master's mark. His mother had made him learn 3 antidotes by heart before she'd let him run his first trial. He made the 3rd one now. He had to come back for his mother's timer mark. She'd have to wait. His mother found him 2 hours later, crouched in the forest with the old man's head in his lap, counting his pulse. "Trial's over," she said. "I know." "You missed the marker." "I know." She looked at the old man. She looked at her son. She sat down in the dirt next to him, without a word, and pressed 2 fingers to the old man's wrist. And when she felt the pulse stabilize, she exhaled once, sharp, through her nose. "Good ratio," she said. "The antidote. 3rd compound. I wasn't certain it would take this long, but I didn't want to risk the faster route." "Correct call." She moved his hand gently away and took over the pulse monitoring. "Go tell your father we have a guest." Devon stood, stretched, looked down at the unconscious Mage Tower Master in his mother's lap. "He's going to owe me," he said. Saris smiled. It was a small smile, the kind she rarely allowed. "Go," she said. The old man's name was Cedrin Vast. He was 71, formerly the head of the Nixian Mage Tower, and he had been wandering the southern forest because, he explained, when he woke in the guest wing 3 days later, with the specific tone of a man explaining something he would rather not, he had been working through a personal, theoretical problem, and had found that moving through difficult terrain helped him think. "You walked into an ancient mana forest because it helps you think," Davin said. "It does help me think." "You almost died." "That is also true." Vast adjusted himself against his pillows. He was thin in the way of people who forget to eat, with white hair that went in several directions and eyes the specific color of deep, still water, the kind that held more than it showed. "You made the antidote." "Yes." "The 3rd compound. Most people wouldn't know which one to use." "My mother was thorough." Vast looked at him steadily. He had that thing all old powerful people developed, the ability to look at something and see what it actually was rather than what it was presenting itself as. "You're not a normal 14-year-old, he said. Devon smiled. "People keep saying that." How much of that is innate, and how much is your extraordinary family? Difficult to separate at this point. The old man was quiet. He turned his wrist and looked at his own Mage Tower seal. Then he looked back at Devon. "I owe you my life," he said. "I pay my debts, within reason. Ask." Devon sat down in the chair beside the bed. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, considering. "Teach me the two-chain rearrangement codes," he said, "while you're recovering." Vast blinked. "That's—" He stopped. He looked at Devon with the careful attention of someone recalibrating a calculation. "You're not asking for something spectacular. Money, influence, connections, you're asking for lessons. You're the best available teacher. It seems efficient. You already have mana cores. The combination of cores and higher magic, I know the theory. Then you know it's dangerous. Magic circles and mana cores work against each other in the same body. The mana from cores floods the circles and they shatter. Magic swordsmen have short, painful, I'm not planning to form a magic circle." Davin paused. "I want to know the code structure. I've been casting without circles." Vast stared. "One-chain spells," Davin continued. "I've managed a few, without a circle. My mana seems," he considered how to phrase this, "pure enough to skip the refinement step." The old man sat forward. In his 70s, recovering from near-fatal poisoning, wearing someone else's sleep clothes, and the change in his posture was immediate and complete. This was the scholar, the expert, the man who had spent 50 years pushing the edges of what was known. "Show me," he said. Davin raised one hand. He gathered what he understood as mana. Not the compressed energy of his cores, but something different, cleaner, like water compared to ice, and shaped it. A simple light spell. A floating sphere of amber light, casting no shadows because he was focusing on heat rather than illumination. Vast made a sound that was not quite a word. "Again," he said. "The fire variant. Don't hold back." Davin made a fireball the size of a melon hover 6 inches above his palm. Cedrin Vast, former head of the Nixian Mage Tower, put both hands over his mouth. "Oh," he said, muffled by hands. "Oh, that's—" He lowered his hands. "You have mana circles. You must." "I don't. I've checked." "Then your mana is—" He shook his head. "The purity would have to be—" Another shake. "I've never. In 50 years of teaching and research, I have never— So you'll teach me." Vast looked at him for a long time. "I want you as a disciple," he said. "No." "The things I could teach you, I appreciate it. No." "Why not?" "I don't want to walk one path." Devon met the old man's eyes. "I'm going to be a mage, a spear practitioner, an assassin, a summoner. I've been told all of these simultaneously are impossible. I find that motivating rather than discouraging." Vast stared. "Teach me the two-chain codes," Devon said. "Write me a recommendation letter for the Imperial Academy. We'll call it even." "That's 2 things. The first is a lesson, the second is a letter. Both are considerably less than your life." He stood. "I'll let you rest." He was at the door when Vast said, "The reason you can cast without circles." Devon stopped. "I don't know yet either," the old man said, "but I will figure it out. Consider it part of our arrangement." Devon looked back. He didn't smile, but it was close. "Get some rest," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." Part 5. The Discovery in the Stone. Chapter 7. What the Stone Held. Vast, as promised, was relentless. The two-chain rearrangement codes took Devon 4 hours. Vast spent the first 3 of those hours waiting for him to fail or ask for simpler versions, and spent the last hour sitting very still while Devon fired a succession of two-chain spells across the training yard with the casual competence of someone checking off items on a list. "You are doing this on purpose," Vast said. "Doing what?" "Making it look easy, to aggravate me." The codes are logical once you understand the layering principle. The difficulty is in memorizing the sequence, not in understanding why the sequence exists. I find the why easier to hold than the what. Vast pinched the bridge of his nose. And you've never formally studied magical theory. My sister Rhea sent books. I read them. Rhea Wren. He said the name with specific weight. Yes, I've heard of her. She destroyed the Mage Tower Selection Committee's standard testing framework when she applied. Had to build a new one for her. She mentioned something like that. Vast looked at him. Does it run in the family, this? He gestured vaguely at all of Davin. I genuinely don't know. They found the stone during a walk to the village supply shop. Davin had gone for magical reagents, specific components he needed for experiments Vast had suggested, now that their lessons had exceeded the original agreement and neither of them had mentioned stopping. Vast had come along because the doctor had said light exercise was good for his recovery, and Vast had interpreted this as accompany the boy who saved your life and observe what happens around him. The shop smelled like copper and dried herbs and old spell resin, a comfortable smell. The owner, a sharp-eyed woman named Darius, had been expecting the Count's household and had several things set aside. Davin was working his way through a box of prepared reagent components when he felt it. A pull. Not mana exactly, something older. He'd started to recognize the feeling. It was the same register as the ancient magic in the Eastern Forest, the same depth frequency that predated every system he'd studied. He followed it to a shelf near the back marked Decoration/Miscellaneous. A stone. Gray-brown, flat on two sides, roughly palm-sized, completely unremarkable. The kind of thing you'd use to prop open a door. He picked it up. The pull intensified so sharply he had to brace his hand against the shelf. Vast appeared at his elbow. "You've gone white," he said. "This stone is doing something." "Let me see." Vast took it, turned it over. His mana-enhanced sight had recovered. He focused on the stone for a long moment. Nothing. Completely inert. Not to me. Davin poured a thread of his own mana into it. The stone lit up. Not dramatically. A slow internal glow, like coal catching fire from inside, orange gold at the core and deepening as the mana moved through it. Symbols rose to the surface, not carved, but revealed, as if they'd been waiting in the material. Vast made a sound. Darius, behind the counter, said, That's odd. That's never—" "I'll buy it," Davin said. Back at the estate, Vast set up his appraisal equipment, a complex arrangement of crystal plates and calibrated focusing rings that he'd apparently been carrying in his personal dimensional space, because of course he had. And they spent the better part of an afternoon extracting what the stone held. What it held was a bracelet. Silver, flat-faced, covered in the same symbols that had risen from the stone's surface, sized for a small wrist. When Davin put it on, it contracted slightly, adjusting, and the symbols brightened. "Ancient runes," Vast said, leaning so close his nose was nearly touching the bracelet. "Arcane, pre-collapse, the language of the Arcanate, the lost empire. 2,000 years dead, possibly more." He straightened. The Arcanate were said to have cultivated forms of magic that no longer exist, that were deliberately erased in the collapse. The surviving records suggest— He stopped, started again. There are scholars who spend their entire careers arguing about what the Arcanate actually practiced. We have fragments, hints, nothing complete. Davin looked at the bracelet on his wrist. He thought about his own mana, the strange purity of it, the way it behaved like no system he'd been taught, the way it resonated with ancient stones and old forests and the East mana field that ate modern spells. "And my mana," he said. Vast looked at him. Could it be arcane mana? Genetically carried? Dormant until activated? Vast was quiet for a long time. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I know what I'm doing when I leave here. Research." "Research." He looked at the bracelet. "Davin, if this is what I think it is—" He stopped, composed himself. "This is not information that should leave this family yet. People would come for you. Not enemies, people who think they're friends, which is worse. Devon nodded. Keep the bracelet covered. Don't use it publicly. Don't let anyone else touch it. Vast paused. And write to your sister, the mage one. Rhea, if anyone can independently verify what your mana actually is, it's her. Devon turned the bracelet. The symbols shifted under his fingers, fluid as if they were alive. Arcanate, he thought. 2,000 years. He was going to need to be considerably more careful. Part 6. The Offer and the Refusal. Chapter 8. The Safe Path. Vast offered him the tower. Not officially. He was careful about that. He was a man who understood that words said aloud became real in a different way than words held in thought, and he held his breath before he said important things, a habit Devon had noticed and catalogued. When you graduate, he said. They were sitting in the garden on Vast's last morning at the estate. His mana had recovered, his body had recovered. The doctor had declared him fit to travel, and he was leaving after breakfast. Whatever you decide to specialize in, the Nixian Tower has a standing offer. Any path. We'll build around your particular situation rather than forcing you into an existing structure. Devon looked at him. That's generous, he said. It's honest. What you are, a pause. What you are doesn't fit neatly into what we've built, but we could grow. We should grow. A Tower Master's legacy is supposed to push boundaries, and you are, he gestured, you are a boundary I have never seen before. The morning light was clean and cold. Sparrows were doing something complicated in the oak at the garden's edge. Devon thought about the tower, the independence of it, the intellectual luxury, a life spent in rooms full of books and willing collaborators, his strange mana studied and protected and celebrated. No battlefield, no blood, a contained life. He could have it. It was genuinely on offer. I want to go to the academy first, he said. Of course. After the academy, I don't know yet. He looked at the oak. I've spent a previous life, metaphorically, inside a single system. I want to see more of them before I choose. Vast was quiet for a moment. Devon felt the old man considering whether to push and deciding not to. The letter, Vast said. I know. Thank you. It's a recommendation, not an obligation. He put something on the bench between them, an envelope sealed with the tower's mark. Whatever you choose, it's yours. Devon picked up the envelope. He thought about the table set for dinner that Kale had died imagining. He thought about this garden, these sparrows, his mother who had been awake since before dawn checking the estate's perimeter, his father who was almost certainly in the training hall already, his sisters far away and building their own extraordinary lives. He thought, I have what I wanted. Whatever comes next, I already have what I wanted. I'll visit the tower, he said, someday, when I've seen enough of everything else. Vast made a sound that was roughly satisfied. I know, he said. Somehow, I knew you'd say that. Part 7. The Academy. Chapter 9. First Gate. The capital city of Ardenmere smelled like horses and bread and the particular ozone of 1,000 mages doing ordinary things with their power. Heating water, lighting corridors, powering the transit gates that moved people across the city's 12 districts. Davin arrived via the transit gate Rhea had built. It was faster than the public system, more precise, and had the added quality of depositing him exactly where she'd calculated he'd want to land. A quiet courtyard off the main road to the Calder estate, out of sight, with time to orient before anyone found him. She'd thought of everything. She always thought of everything. He stood in the courtyard for a moment, feeling the city settle around him. 14 years old, 2 lifetimes of preparation. A letter from a Tower Master in his bag, a bracelet of ancient metal on his wrist, cores and mana unlike anything the systems here were built to measure, and somewhere in this city, he felt this more than knew it, the person who had killed him in his first life was going about his mornings without knowing that the ghost of his most interesting failure had arrived to study in his empire. Be interesting, he told himself. Not threatening, interesting. He picked up his bag. He walked out of the courtyard. He found the escort that the Duke had sent, a captain named Lyra Vane, efficient and perceptive, who took one look at him and said, "We were told to expect the Count's son, my lord, not someone this young," and then corrected herself before Devon could respond. "My apologies, the Count's son." She said it differently the second time, like she'd recalibrated. Good instincts. He liked her immediately. The Calder estate was what old money chose when it was confident enough not to perform. Not the largest in the capital district, but solid. The architecture of a family that had been important for long enough that it no longer needed to look important. The staff moved with the practiced ease of people who had served well for a long time and knew it. Mira met him at the inner gate. She was 16 now. She had grown into her quiet in the way that some people grow into their height. It suited her now the way it hadn't quite at 9, less like restraint and more like chosen ground. She was taller than Devon remembered. She had the same careful eyes. "You're late," she said. "The transit gate calculated for a different arrival time. Rhea's math is very accurate for most routes and creative for others. You've been corresponding with your sister." "For years." She looked him over with the assessor's attention that was, he suspected, a trait she'd absorbed from her father rather than been taught. "You're shorter than I expected." "I'm 14. "I know. Still." She stepped aside. "Come in. Father's waiting." They walked through the estate and Mira talked, not about Devon, not about the academy, but about the house. Which staff members had been there since before she was born? Which corridors connected through what she called the informal route, and what he recognized as the emergency exit architecture his mother had taught him to identify. Where the good light was in the afternoon, where the cook kept the extra tea. She was telling him how the house worked, the same way his mother had told him how the estate worked. He kept his face neutral. He paid very close attention. Vareth Calder had changed. Not dramatically. He was still the same basic architecture of a man, solid, deliberate, built for endurance rather than elegance. But there was something in him that hadn't been there at the estate visit 6 years ago. A careful quality, a preservation. The way people move when something they love is fragile. The Duchess, Devon understood, was still ill. "Ren," Calder said. He didn't extend a hand this time. Instead, he put one on Devon's shoulder and looked at him seriously. "You've grown." 6 years will do that. "Are you ready for the academy?" "Yes." The Duke held his gaze for a moment. That careful reading thing again, the thing that had noticed something in Devon's 8-year-old stance and named it old experience, even when the evidence shouldn't have supported it. "Mira tells me she wants to spar with you before exams," he said. "She mentioned it. She's been training hard." A pause. "Very hard. Since we visited your family, something changed that trip." He seemed to consider whether to continue. "I'm glad you're here. She needed someone to push against who wasn't me." Devon thought about what it must be. A father who loved his daughter too much to push her as hard as she needed to be pushed, because the part of him that needed to push was occupied with worry. "I'll spar with her," he said, "as hard as she wants." Calder looked at him. "Even if you hurt her feelings?" "Especially then." Chapter 10. Mira's Defeat. The morning light hit the training yard clean and cold, and Mira was already there. She was moving through forms, sword, not summon, her silver fox familiar curled in the corner of the yard, watching with the amber patience of a creature that had seen this 1,000 times. Good forms, strong forms. The kind of forms that win junior tournaments and impress people who haven't seen more than junior tournaments. Davin watched from the gate for a moment before she noticed him. He saw it, the half step, always the same one. After the third movement in the right shoulder series, her weight distribution shifted fractionally, a micro-hesitation that seemed invisible at normal speed, but created a cascade effect through the next 4 movements, slightly off, each one slightly less than it could be. "You're early," she said when she saw him. You started early. She lowered her sword. You were watching. Yes. And? He walked into the yard. He picked up a practice weapon from the rack, a short sword, the closest to what his body remembered best, and settled into a stance that wasn't any formal school's stance, just what worked. Show me, he said. She came at him. She was fast. Genuinely fast. The tournament win wasn't luck. The training was real. The mana use was integrated in the way that only happened when someone had worked it into muscle memory rather than deliberate application. He had to be honest about that. She was very good. He was better. Not because he was more talented, because he had 23 years of battlefield memory behind his 14-year-old body, and the battlefield does not teach the same things that training yards teach. Training yards teach you to fight. Battlefields teach you to make someone not want to fight back. He let her press him. He let her feel the success of it. 2 exchanges, 3. The 4th, he slipped instead of blocking, and she overcommitted, and he stepped inside her guard and tapped her shoulder with the blunt. She reset. Her face was careful. She came again, faster this time. Good adjustment. He blocked, redirected, created a moment where her timing was exposed, and stepped through it. Stop, she said, after the 5th time. He stopped. She stood with her sword at her side and looked at the ground, breathing. You're reading me. Yes. How far ahead? 3 to 4 movements on average. He watched her absorb this. After your 3rd right shoulder movement, your weight shifts left. You don't notice it. It makes everything after it slightly wrong. She was quiet. You're not angry, he said, which means you knew something was off and couldn't identify it. 2 years, she said. I knew something was off for 2 years. It's a good habit that became fixed too early. Your teacher probably praised the 3rd movement because it's genuinely strong. The correction after it got reinforced as standard. She looked up. Can you fix it? Show me the movement again, slower. She did. He watched. He walked over and put his hand on her shoulder. She held very still, like someone trying not to startle, and adjusted her weight distribution 2 centimeters. Try the sequence. She moved through it. The improvement was immediate, and she felt it. The fluid connection that had been missing, the way each movement fed the next without the small compensating jerk. She stopped. She looked at her own hands. One correction, she said. The right correction. She turned to look at him. Her expression was complicated, in the way of people who have wanted something for a long time and received it from an unexpected direction and don't quite know how to hold the shape of the relief. Why didn't my teacher catch it? Probably because they were watching the result rather than the mechanism. He stepped back. Your result looked good enough. The mechanism was off. A pause. The mechanism is always what matters. Mira stared at him for a long moment. Then she lunged and hugged him, which was so unexpected. She was not, in any of his previous mental categories, a hugger, that he didn't react in time and simply stood there with her arms around him while his brain tried to catch up. Thank you, she said, muffled against his shoulder. You're welcome. She released him. She stepped back. Her face had returned to careful, but there was something warm underneath it, something that hadn't been there before. Okay, she said. Again. Part 8. The Examination. Chapter 11. How the Tests Work. 6,000 applicants. The first examination, written, general, eliminated 4,000. Among the 2,000 remaining, Davin had the highest score. Mira had the highest score in the swordsmanship track, which was, everyone agreed, exactly what was expected of Duke Calder's daughter. The second examination, specialty placement, was where things became unusual. The other applicants chose departments: magic, swordsmanship, summoning, martial arts, alchemy, theology, exploration. The departments had histories, structures, professors with opinions, cohorts with cultures. Devon submitted his application to the autonomous course. The autonomous course was the Academy's oldest and least used track. a designation created 2 centuries ago to accommodate exceptional students whose abilities genuinely couldn't be contained in a single department. It required passing the entrance examinations for 3 chosen departments. Failing any one meant total failure, and its last successful applicant had been an emperor. Before that, a scholar who had subsequently vanished into his research and not been heard from in decades. The faculty meeting that occurred when they noticed his application was, by several accounts, extended. Chapter 12. The Summoning Examiner. The summoning examination first. The examiner was a woman named Professor Delna Savaris, mid-40s, compact, with the kind of coiled stillness Devon associated with people who spent a great deal of time around things that could eat them. Her reputation was that she held the record for simultaneous control of 5th-class summons and that she had failed 43 applicants in a row before passing one, and that one had been Claire. She looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "The autonomous application," she said. "Yes. You understand what it requires. 3 separate examinations. Failure in any terminates the entire process. The standard for each department's autonomous entrance is demonstrably higher than the standard for that department's regular entrance." "Yes." She looked at him. "Most applicants to the autonomous course overestimate their breadth and underestimate the depth that breadth requires. They feel they're talented in many areas. They find out that many areas means mastery in all of them." "I understand." "Then show me." She hadn't asked a question, she had simply opened space. Devon had thought about this, not what to demonstrate, he knew that, but how to demonstrate it in a way that was useful rather than flashy, that showed the examiner something she hadn't seen rather than something she'd graded before. "May I request something?" he said. She raised an eyebrow. "Would you summon something? Your choice of difficulty. I'd like to demonstrate my approach to an unfamiliar summon rather than calling something pre-established." Delna Savaris was very still for a moment. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had found something interesting. "Most applicants bring their own summons to these evaluations," she said. "Prepared, controlled, known quantities." "I know." "You want me to present a variable and let me see how you handle it?" "Yes." She regarded him for another moment. Then she brought forth the Ruin Hound. It appeared the way serious summons appeared. Not dramatically, not with theatrical effect, but with pressure, with the sudden redistribution of atmosphere in the room, with the low harmonic that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite anything else. A creature the size of a small horse, built wrong by any natural taxonomy, too many joints, too much head, eyes like polished carnelian, and a stillness that was the stillness of something deciding whether you were worth its attention. The other examiners took a step back. Devon walked toward it. Not a charge, not a performance, a walk, steady, with his hands at his sides and his attention entirely on the hound rather than on anyone watching. He did what his body knew from the ancient forest, from Claire's familiars who had always liked him, from the wolf at his birthday who had turned around mid-charge. He made himself present. Not threat, not submission, simply here, real, calm. The hound turned one enormous head. He felt the thread, the mana connection between creature and summoner, the leash, the bond. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. He simply let his own mana, that strange, too pure to be normal mana, move naturally into the air between them. The hound sat down. It put its head on his outstretched hand. One of the other examiners made a sound. Delna Savaris stood very still. "The connection between a summon and its summoner is maintained by resonance," Devon said. He kept his voice even, kept his hand where it was. "When the resonance of another party is strong enough and compatible enough, the summon reads it as a potential primary bond, not theft, not command, invitation." "You're not a registered summoner," she said. "You have no sigil." No. You should not be able to create that resonance. I know. She was quiet for a long time. Step back, she said finally. He did. The hound settled, returned its attention to its summoner, the bond re-establishing as he removed himself from the field. Delna Savaris looked at him with the specific expression of someone whose framework for understanding their own field has just been challenged. Pass, she said. We'll discuss the nature of your talent with the department head. Chapter 13. The Sword That Was Supposed to Fail Him. Professor Cavil Reth was the director of the autonomous course. He had taken the position 6 years ago because, and this was a poorly kept open secret among the faculty, the autonomous course had not had a student in 3 decades and showed no signs of having one anytime soon, which meant the director's role was administrative fiction, which meant it carried salary and institutional prestige and required precisely nothing. He was, to be direct, getting paid to do nothing, and he had arranged this deliberately, and he was very good at it. He was 53. He was a hex-bound swordsman. He had fought in 3 campaigns, served as a commander of the Imperial Special Guard, written 2 treatises on advanced mana integration in combat, and had earned the right, he felt, to spend the remainder of his career in exactly this comfortable administrative nothing. And then Davin Wren appeared on his desk. Reth read the application twice. Then he read the examiner notes from the written test. Then he read Vast's recommendation letter, which was uncomfortable. Vast did not praise people easily. He had known the man for 30 years and had never seen him write a letter like this one. He sat in his office for a long time. Then he went to find the boy. His plan was simple. The swordsmanship evaluation for autonomous entry was his to administer, and the evaluation required a candidate to demonstrate both theoretical knowledge and practical competency. And the boy had not, critically, taken the swordsmanship examination in the standard admissions process, which meant Reth could set the standard. And if the standard happened to be quite high, and the boy happened to fail it, then the boy would have to apply to a regular department like a normal person, and Reth's peaceful administrative life would continue undisturbed. He found the boy in the courtyard outside the academy's main examination hall. Davin Wren was 14 years old, silver-haired, and standing in a way that bothered Reth immediately. Not because the stance was aggressive, but because it wasn't anything recognizable. Not a formal school stance, not the shaped-for-display posture of noble children who'd been trained since they could walk. Something else. Something that had been worn down to what actually worked. "You're the autonomous course director," the boy said. "I am. I'm administering your swordsmanship evaluation." "All right. Do you have any formal swordsmanship training?" The boy looked at him calmly. "I've read extensively on the subject." Reth relaxed. Books. He'd hoped for this. "I see. And the practical component? Let's find out." The terms Reth set were generous. If the boy could touch him once, he passed. Reth would limit himself to 2 steps of movement. He'd set these terms before. They always worked. A 2-step restriction meant nothing when the difference in skill level was sufficient. And Reth had fought real opponents, real wars, and this was a 14-year-old who'd read books. He prepared himself in the way he prepared for demonstrations. Enough focus to be safe, no more. Enough to make the failing look instructive rather than humiliating. The boy came at him, fast. Not surprisingly fast. Reth had the mana-enhanced senses of a hex-bound fighter, and he saw the attack coming. But the shape of it was wrong. Wrong in the specific way that made his body move before his mind caught up. He sidestepped. The boy adjusted mid-motion. Reth blocked. Not redirected, blocked, which he had not planned to do, which meant the attack had been real enough to require it. Interesting, he thought, and brought his full attention forward for the first time. What he saw, as Davin pressed, as the exchange accelerated, as Reth found himself using his second step and starting to think very carefully about the geometry of his remaining options, was not the technique of a student. It was the negative space of technique. All the things that formal training left behind, the moment-based adjustments, the weight distribution adaptations, the particular ruthlessness of someone who has swung a sword not in a yard, but in a field where missing meant dying. That's battlefield footwork, Reth thought, with a cold clarity. That's what a soldier looks like 6 years in. He was thinking this when the boy's blade touched his shoulder. Very light, controlled. Not an accident, a choice. Reth stood still. Davin Ren lowered his sword. "I believe," the boy said, "I passed." Reth looked at him for a long time. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" "I read, 'Don't,'" Reth said it quietly. "I've been studying human violence professionally for 30 years. That is not reading, that's experience." The boy held his gaze. "I've lived," he said carefully, "with a parent who was in 3 major campaigns and another parent who was the Empire's premier specialist. I grew up in a building full of people who took every aspect of the subject extremely seriously." Reth considered this. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a lie. "Pass," he said. The word felt like something he'd been maneuvered into, which was new. Reth had spent 6 years maneuvering himself into comfortable positions. He had just been outmaneuvered by a 14-year-old with good posture and an implausibly vague explanation. "Thank you, Director," Devon said. "Reth," he said before he'd decided to. "Call me Reth." The boy tilted his head slightly. Something in the look, not quite amusement, not quite warmth, something older than both. "All right," Devon said. "Reth." Part 9. What the Academy Held. Chapter 14. The Fog Garden. The Academy's northern grounds contained the Heather Garden. What this meant in practice: a garden that was almost always beautiful, frequently foggy, and increasingly difficult to navigate once the weather shifted. Students avoided it before exams. Staff avoided it in autumn. The prevailing institutional theory was that Saul Heathgate, the Academy's founder, a mage of extraordinary ability and arguably questionable judgment about which projects to pursue, had installed some kind of environmental ward that had been deteriorating for 2 centuries into something that functioned less like a ward and more like a persistent and escalating inconvenience. Devon walked through it on his 3rd day. He wasn't trying to discover anything. He was taking the shortest route from the administrative hall to the north dormitory, and the Heather Garden was, on a clear sky morning with low mist that hadn't yet thickened, exactly as navigable as it looked. He heard the voice about halfway through. "Hello? Can anyone... Hello? I've been in here for... Is anyone there?" He found the student sitting on a bench with a compass that was spinning freely in its case, surrounded by maps, drawing a 3rd map. He was small, thin, wore spectacles held together at one hinge with what appeared to be a piece of wire, and was covered in the kind of damp that accumulated not from rain, but from prolonged contact with misted air. He looked up when Davin approached with the expression of someone who had been lost long enough to stop expecting rescue. "Oh," he said, "you're not faculty." "1st year." "Me too. Exploration department." He held out the compass. "Do you know why the needle does that?" "Ancient mana field. It disrupts modern calibration. The compass is responding to 2 magnetic references simultaneously." The student stared at him. "That's... You worked that out from looking at it?" "I've spent time around ancient mana fields. The signature is similar." Davin looked around the garden. The mist was thicker here, near the center, and at the center, just barely visible, something that might be a structure. "How long have you been in here?" "I was doing research. I lost track." A pause. "About 2 hours?" "Come on! How do you know which way?" Devon had already started walking. He had the same sense here that he had in the eastern forest. Not comfort exactly, but recognition. His mana moved differently in spaces that held ancient power. He could feel the field's structure, the way you could feel the shape of a room by sound in the dark. He walked toward the center. The student, who gave his name as Tomas, Exploration Department, first year, here because he was certain something was hidden in the garden and had decided to find it before anyone else did, followed, alternately taking notes and nearly falling over rocks he hadn't noticed. The structure at the center was a fountain, a very old fountain. The stone was not the Academy stone, different color, different texture, carved in patterns that belonged to no style Devon could place as contemporary. It wasn't running, hadn't run in a long time, but the magic in it was unmistakably active, slow, deep, like breathing from something very large. He put his hand on the basin rim. The bracelet warmed. He pulled back his sleeve. The symbols on the bracelet were moving, rotating slowly, a complex arrangement, reading themselves in sequence. "What's that?" Tomas said, peering at the bracelet. "Something I found." Devon looked at the fountain. These symbols match. On the basin, he pointed to a line of marks half hidden under moss. "Do you read old scripts?" Tomas straightened. "My family studies pre-collapse civilizations. I can read about 12 archaic scripts, some better than others." "Arcanate." Tomas's expression shifted entirely. "Where did you see—" "Here," Devon pointed. "These marks. I can't read them. Can you?" Tomas came forward, pulled off his spectacles, wiped them on his shirt, replaced them, and leaned in close to the basin with the focused expression of someone who had found exactly what they were looking for, but was being very careful not to let that show too much. He murmured to himself, cross-referenced something in the notebook he was carrying, murmured again. "It says," he said finally, "those who carry the inheritance prove the inheritance remains." Roughly. Some of the middle terms are conjugated in a form that's older than the standard dictionary. "An inheritance test," Davin said. "Yes, a qualification check." Tomas looked up. "For what?" Davin thought about the bracelet, about the stone it had been sealed inside, about Vast's face when he'd seen Davin cast two-chain magic without a circle. He poured his mana into the fountain. The Heather Garden's ancient field responded like a lock finding a key. Light came up through the basin. Not dramatic light, not the kind of light that performed itself, but quiet light, the kind that simply was present rather than trying to be seen. The symbols across the basin completed themselves, lines connecting lines, and from somewhere deep under the stone, a harmonic rose that was less sound and more recognition. The fountain had been waiting for this. Devon had been carrying what it was waiting for, the inheritance, whatever the Arcanate had left here in this hidden center of a garden that discouraged visitors, sealed behind a mana field that ate modern spells, settled into him the way the Eastern Forest's mana had never quite settled, completely, like water finding its level. The magic circle in his heart formed. He felt it simultaneously with the recognition that it shouldn't be possible. A circle and cores together, the two systems that destroyed each other when combined, and waited for the conflict. It didn't come. The circle integrated, not competing with the cores, completing them, like a third voice in a harmony that had been waiting for its part. He sat down on the fountain's edge. Tomas very wisely said nothing for a long moment. "Are you all right?" he asked finally. Devon considered the question honestly. Something happened that shouldn't be possible. Is it bad? I don't know yet. He felt the circle, explored it with the same careful attention he'd used on every new weapon he'd ever held. It doesn't feel bad. Tomas sat down beside him. He was quiet in the way of someone who was experiencing something extraordinary and was genuinely prioritizing the other person's experience of it over his own reaction. Then, "I memorized the full basin inscription while that was happening, in case it matters." Devon looked at him. "For the research," Tomas said. "In case it matters for the research." He's going to be useful, Devon thought, not unkindly, and more than useful. He noticed I was in distress, and his response was to make sure information was preserved. That's loyalty before trust. That's the kind of thing that matters later. "Thank you," he said. Tomas nodded like it was nothing. They sat together in the heather garden while the ancient light slowly faded, and neither of them said anything else for a while. Part 10. The Breakdown. Chapter 15. What Cannot Be Fixed. His second week at the academy, Davin made a mistake. It wasn't tactical. It wasn't the kind that got people killed or even hurt. It was the kind that only mattered because of what it revealed about a gap he hadn't known was there. He was in the Advanced Mana Theory seminar, invited, not enrolled, a distinction the department head had been very precise about, and the professor asked him to demonstrate his approach to multi-element combination casting. He did, and it was too much. Not the casting itself. The casting was fine, was in fact extraordinarily clean, 7 elements in fluid sequence with the kind of control that took most mages a decade to approximate. He knew this. He had known as he was doing it that it was impressive in a way that exceeded what the room was built to handle. He watched the other students' faces, and he saw it. Not admiration, something else. The specific expression of people who have been working hard at something for years and have just watched someone do it in 4 minutes. And what the face does in that moment is not rage, which is simple, but something quieter and more corrosive. The beginning of the thought, "Why am I here?" He finished the demonstration. He answered the professor's questions. He gathered his notes and walked out. He went to the one place he knew would be empty at midday, the eastern-facing room of the library's second floor, a room full of very old books on subjects no longer studied, where the light came in at an angle that made reading comfortable, and the dust motes moved slowly, and no one from any department had reason to be. He sat down. He thought about the faces. He had spent his first life being invisible, and then being a weapon, and then dying before he'd learned to be anything else. He had spent these 14 years being extraordinary, and had told himself this was fine, that it was what the second chance was for, that the family and the warmth and the belonging were sufficient. But there was a version of belonging he hadn't considered, the kind that required you to be equal, the kind built on shared struggle rather than shared admiration. The kind where someone next to you was working as hard as you were and sometimes beating you. He didn't have that. He'd had Mira, but he'd dismantled her in 4 minutes flat with a single correction, and she was his friend, but she was not his equal. Not right now, and she knew it, and they both lived inside that knowledge. He'd had Tomas, but Tomas didn't fight, didn't train. His gift was something different. He sat in the old library room for 2 hours and thought, "I'm alone in a way I didn't plan for. I have everything I wanted, and I'm still alone in a way I didn't plan for. I know how to be a weapon. I know how to be a student. I know how to impress people and protect people and fix people's footwork and recognize ancient mana and cast without circles and make tower masters take me seriously. I don't know how to simply be someone's peer. I never learned that. In the first life, there was no time, and in this life, there was no one. And I've been so busy becoming extraordinary that I didn't notice what it was costing me until this moment, in a dusty room, with dust motes moving slowly, with the sense memory of 23 faces going quiet in a seminar room where I'd just been too much." He stayed in the room. He didn't find a solution. He didn't have a plan. He sat with the discomfort of something genuinely missing, something that could not be compensated for with practice or dedication or ancient mana. And eventually, the light changed, and he realized several hours had passed, and he was late for summoning theory, and he hadn't eaten. He stood. He picked up his notes. He did not feel better. He went to dinner. Part 11. The Familiar. Chapter 16. 7 years. The egg had been in his care since Claire put it in his hands on his 7th birthday. He'd fed it mana twice daily without interruption for 7 years. Morning before training, evening before sleep. The rhythm of it had become so habitual that he did it the way he breathed, not thinking about it, the body knowing before the mind arrived. The egg had never hatched. He'd researched familiars extensively in 2 different library systems over 7 years and understood the theory. The creature inside the egg was selecting for a specific mana signature, a particular resonance, and would absorb mana indefinitely until either the conditions were met or the creature inside ceased to be viable. Some eggs never hatched. Some took generations. He'd chosen to simply trust. On his second week at the academy, 3 days after the library room, and 2 days after a conversation with Rhea through the crystal that had been more honest than he'd planned, "You're allowed to not have everything figured out," she'd said, which was very direct and very Rhea. He was sitting at his desk at midnight, feeding the egg its evening ration when it moved. Not subtly, not ambiguously. A hard, sharp shift, like something inside had decided. He picked it up. It was warm. Warmer than it had been. And the shell under his hands was different. The texture of it, the density, something was happening inside. He went to find Claire. Her laboratory at the academy was the kind of space that accumulated around someone who used it seriously. Towers of research texts, equipment of ambiguous purpose arranged with apparent randomness that was actually very precise. Summons cataloged in terrariums sorted by class and disposition. And Claire herself at a center desk at midnight with the focused expression of someone who was on to something interesting. She looked up when he came in. She looked at the egg. She stood immediately. "Put it on the stabilizer," she said. They worked quickly. Mana filters, environmental calibration, the stabilizing field that would protect the laboratory from whatever happened if this was what it looked like. Claire moved with the calm speed of expertise, checking each element twice. "How long has it been responding?" she asked. 20 minutes. "Your mana changed." Not a question. She'd felt it when he walked in, the circle alongside the cores, the new integration. This week? 3rd day. "The ancient mana you absorbed." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment, adjusting a filter. "I want to be in the room when it hatches." "Obviously." She looked at him, brief, full. The way she looked at the summons she cared for most. Not scientifically, but genuinely. The look that was, "You matter, and I'm paying attention." "Feed it everything you have," she said, "until you can't." It took 4 hours. At some point, Devon was sitting on the laboratory floor because his legs had stopped cooperating, and Claire had brought a cushion without comment and placed it under him, and he'd accepted this as the obvious correct action and kept feeding the egg. The shell cracked at approximately 2 in the morning. Not dramatically, a single line, clean, like good pottery opening. Then another. Then the shell opened outward, and what was inside pushed through, not in pieces, but all at once, small and sudden and entirely present. And it sat in the broken shell and looked at them. White, small, wings folded tight against a body the size of his forearm, scales like new coins, eyes that were not reptile eyes, not bird eyes, something else. Eyes that looked and then considered what they saw. It opened its mouth. It breathed fire. A small, careful, extremely controlled column of flame, approximately the temperature of a hot summer day, aimed precisely between them and hitting nothing. Demonstration, Davin thought, not threat. That was a demonstration. "I don't recognize the species," Claire said, with the voice of someone experiencing genuine wonder and the presence of mind to not perform it. She was already reaching for a notebook. Davin moved forward slowly. He sat down at the familiar's eye level. He let it look at him. It looked at him for a long time with those considering eyes. Then it walked over his hand and up his arm and curled itself around his shoulders and put its head against his ear, and the warmth of it was the warmth of coals that had been burning all night, and it breathed once, slow, and went still. Claire made a small sound. Devon sat very still. The familiar breathed against his ear. "Found you," something seemed to say, in no language, in pure tone. About time, Devon thought back. Claire was writing in her notebook with great focus and the smallest possible smile visible at the corner of her mouth. "From beyond the horizon," she said. "What?" "The origin point, where it came from." She didn't look up. "There are summoners who can reach the space beyond the horizon, a different world or what connects to one. Most of what comes through are spirits, fragments, an actual creature fully formed that can bond." She paused. "I can do it with spirits, minor ones." This is different. You're saying what I think you're saying. I'm saying your familiar came from somewhere we don't have maps for, and it waited 7 years for your mana to be ready, and it's very small and currently asleep on your shoulder." She looked up. "Name it." He thought about it. The creature's scales were white. The fire had been exact. The consideration in those eyes had been ancient, in the way the fountain was ancient, in the way his own mana was ancient, something that knew it was operating at a depth most things didn't reach. "Ash," he said. Claire tested it aloud. "Ash." The familiar's tail twitched. "Ash," Davin said again. The creature opened one eye, looked at him, closed it. "Ash it is," Claire said. Hashtag epilogue. He walked back to the dormitory at 4 in the morning with Ash asleep across his shoulders like a scaled scarf, warm and self-contained, dreaming whatever creatures from beyond the horizon dream. The academy's halls were empty. His footsteps were the only sound. He reached his room. He turned on one light, low, the reading lamp, and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the window where the early dark was beginning to consider becoming pre-dawn. He thought about Kale dying in a field. He thought about Aldrich teaching him spear forms in rain light. He thought about Ceres's hand pushing the hair from his eyes, the struck bell feeling of it. He thought about Rhea's ring, tuned to his mana alone. Lena's summons watching over his crib. Vast's letter written with genuine care. He thought about Mira's footwork correction and the hug he hadn't been ready for. He thought about Tomas memorizing the fountain inscription because it might matter later. He thought about the library room, the dust motes, the thing he hadn't known was missing until he sat with it. Ash lifted their head, looked at him with those considering eyes, breathed out a small, warm, careful breath, then put their head back down on his shoulder and went back to sleep. "I know," Devon thought. I know. The lamp made a small circle of light. Outside, the pre-dawn birds were beginning something. He sat in the warm circle. He breathed with the creature on his shoulder. He didn't move for a long time. The window began, very slowly, to lighten. Deep in the heather garden, where the fountain had stood for 2 centuries waiting, the basin's ancient symbols continued to glow, not dimming now, but changing. A new line completing itself in the stone, one that had not been there before the boy arrived, one that no scholar at the academy had ever seen. It read, in the language of the Arcanate, in a script old enough to predate the word for dynasty. The second is always different. End of Part 1. Copyright original work. All names, places, systems, and events are the author's own invention. Structural inspiration drawn from the reincarnation fantasy genre. No text reproduced from any prior work.